Welcome to the Proactive Security Podcast with Mike Hodges and Brine Hamilton. This podcast is dedicated to discussing violence prevention in healthcare. We want to inform, equip, and empower healthcare security leaders to prevent violence before it happens. And now, here's your hosts, Mike and Brine.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike.
And I'm Brine.
And this is the Proactive Security Podcast, Episode 7.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We are very excited to have our first guest on the Proactive Security Podcast. We are joined today by Ryan King. Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, Ryan, let's get started by learning a bit about you. Can you tell us about yourself?
Sure. This year actually marks 20 years in healthcare security and about 5 years previous security experience before that. Went to college, got a master's in criminal justice and security administration and 2 bachelors in information technology and emergency management. And been working predominantly here in Central Florida area for about 18 of those 20 years.
Excellent stuff. Now I can say personally, right now when we're recording this podcast, I'm in Ontario, Canada, specifically Niagara Falls today. Mike is in Georgia. Ryan, like you said, is in Florida. I had the opportunity to meet Ryan at a IHSS AC&E a few years back. So, going into it, just some of the buzz, there's a lot of people talking about Ryan, especially at the leadership event that we were at, just doing some great things. Had a lot of positive things to say about him. Got to speak with him throughout the conference. Got to meet some of his family. I believe you brought your daughter there, who's a very mature, very likable young woman. So, doing great things in our industry and great things as a parent as well. So again, just an honor to have you on here and happy to have this discussion today.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey Ryan, I want to jump right into talking about de-escalation with you. You recently put out a blog relevant to what Brine and I have been talking about on the podcast last month and now this month, talking about de-escalation challenges during unstable times. You want to tell us a little bit about what kind of pushed you to write that?
Sure. A lot of it is just personal experience. We've had de-escalation training. The security department provides it for the hospital employees in my system. And we found that things changed quite a bit when COVID started. I will also say there's some other things. Everybody knows 2020 was the year of COVID, but also the political upheaval, some of the racial injustice conversations and all that really changed. So what had happened was where de-escalation was mostly dealing with high-risk patients, sometimes those with traumatic brain injury or other medical concerns that gave them an altered mental status. That was 90% of our de-escalation. Now we're dealing with long wait times in the ER due to temperatures being taken, limitation of visitors. We're still under an only 1 visitor per patient ruling. I believe most of Florida is still under that and everything. So obviously when you're talking about people end of life and so forth, a lot of family shows up and only 1 or 2 are allowed up at alternating times. So all these different environmental concerns and mental stressors that are around people, they're also coming in more highly stressed. So our de-escalation before was primarily somebody's upset with their care, upset with something a physician said or whatever. Now they're almost coming in with this heightened level of anxiety. So we're not having a chance to really head it off at the pass. We're having to deal with it in the midst of it, in the middle of the lobby a lot of times. So we found we had to really adjust our training and adjust those skill sets to kind of meet that demand.
It really has been a fascinating year of changes just across the board in the industry. And I think you highlight some very interesting points there. How have you seen that relate to the stress on your officers in the front line as they're engaging in a lot of these different types of encounters?
So we actually had a class that myself and one of my captains led for the entire department. And it was what happens when you have to de-escalate the de-escalators. And because a lot of them are dealing with financial concerns, either luckily, knock on wood, I have not had to cut any hours or positions yet, but a lot of them, their spouses or significant others may have, lost hours, lost income. There's more stress under them. I've definitely been almost hands and knees with the officers. They're asking for overtime, asking for extra shifts, special duties, things like that to try to help alleviate financial concerns. And I don't think I have to tell anybody in this industry, we don't buy anybody new Mercedes with our wages. So that's always a struggle in itself. And so a lot of times we take a breather during that roll call, the beginning of every shift. We always have a roll call just to pass on information and so forth. But we've actually started taking a 5-minute almost breather session to where everybody just stops. Don't worry about the drama. Don't worry about the reports. Don't worry about the Baker Acts. Just take a minute. Let's talk about it. Anybody got any good news they want to bring up today or whatever? And try to get everybody in the right mindset before they go out on the field.
I think that's a great idea. I could see a lot of benefit from having that kind of just momentary pause where everybody collects their thoughts before they get out there and deal with the world. I talk a lot about with my team, and I love that, how do you de-escalate the de-escalators thought process? Because I talk a lot about my team. Everybody in the organization gets to lose their mind at some point, but we don't. We have to be the calm in the storm all the time. And that's a burden to bear in our modern industry and a burden to put on those frontline officers day in and day out. And I think you bring up a lot of interesting points.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody is facing them. We also many times have to remind our officers, that nurse that snapped at you, or that, that manager or administrator that maybe was a little more aggressive toned than usual. It's like they're under the same stress. Again, Florida is very seasonally based volume. Early COVID, our volume dropped to almost nothing for obvious reasons. But I would say since September, we have been very busy, a lot of times near max capacity. Unfortunately, as we see these rises in some COVID cases and everything else, plus just the snowbirds we get down here, we are constantly staying busy. The patients are more acute, require more medical needs. So a lot of our clinical staff are burned out also. And it just leads sometimes to interactions that are not intended, but they happen. And so a lot of times, again, we're de-escalating our own people to say, look, it's just one of those days. Don't worry about it. Shuck it off. Go on about the day.
Right. I think one of the things that you mentioned too, that I don't want to say that collectively we dismiss, but maybe it's just something that we aren't necessarily cognizant of, is just, again, the stressors, those other additional stressors that impact things like the restrictions, for example, that we're facing, depending on where you are geographically. And then the other piece too, that I didn't take into consideration in the beginning, and you just kind of made me remember it, is, all of us are thankful because we're still employed during this. And a lot of people are being impacted because they don't have work. But the other piece that you mentioned there, and I had to, again, early on, I had to really think about this hard, was that even though all of us are working, a lot of us have a spouse at home that's not working, and just the financial strain that causes, and how that impacts relationships, and how that manifests itself once you're back out in the workplace.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, even some turnover, and I don't consider this necessarily bad turnover, because everybody at the end of the day is trying to feed their family. And we, now that the vaccines are out and things like that, but a lot of people are still not back to work. I do see a lot of hiring signs out, but I know more people that are still looking for work than have found work. And so a lot of times some of my officers are either moving to higher paying areas, or they're changing careers and going into something that can sustain a family a little easier, especially my younger ones. I would say under 35, 40-year-olds, that's been a key driver to some of our turnover.
I think it's interesting to talk about that financial piece as it affects our staff, but that's also a key driver in the escalation and the frustration and the uncertainty that we see in our patients and our visitors. I mean, they're coming into a hospital for whatever reason, probably thinking in the back of their minds about the bill and what's this going to cost me and how's this going to change nature for my family, in conjunction with dealing with probably similar financial stressors in their own life as a result of the pandemic. So I think all of that just continues to build that melting pot of contributing factors that stimulates the violence that we see in a healthcare environment, which is really interesting. I'd be curious, Ryan, you talk a little bit about kind of what de-escalation has been in the past and what it needs to be shifting towards in the future. Can you kind of share a little bit of your thoughts with our listeners about that, where de-escalation has been and where it is now, and then where it's going or where it needs to go?
Sure. So again, I won't mention any specific programs of de-escalation. I think all of them have their place. I do think a lot of the programs that you use, and even if you build an in-house one, which is what we've moved to, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, they were built for a specific clientele. So the system that we used before was an 8-hour training class. We had to send a trainer away to be a certified trainer, and then they came back and taught an 8-hour class. Well, first of all, an 8-hour class is a lot of commitment. Again, kind of back to the finances of business this year and everything, paying non-productive time for 1,000, 2,000 clinical caregivers to go to an 8-hour class may or may not happen. And a lot of them, when you look at the scenario-based training that's given during their drills and so forth, it's really for that 1-to-1 or sometimes 2 staff to 1 patient. And again, it's driven towards patient. It's about talking about their care plan, trying to de-escalate noise, light, sound, all that in their area and everything else. We're not seeing the patient issue. We are still seeing de-escalation of some patients, mostly our drug abuse, our post-surgical, our neuro area, drug abuse. Those are probably the 4 key areas. But a lot of those people in that exact same 4 groups that I just mentioned, they do not have appropriate cognitive awareness or the mental stability to handle a care plan. So you're going in and trying to give somebody a 12-hour care plan. If you behave this way, then this is what we'll do. They're not taking that in. They're not remembering that, and or they just simply can't comply with that. Another problem is that a lot of them are checklist based. And to me, this was a big thing that I found with ours. All of the steps were good. And we used this training in our psychiatric unit, and it worked very well, because they deal with those type of patients every day. So that becomes their daily operating program. Now you put that on an ortho floor or an ICU floor, somewhere where maybe they see one of these behavior compromised patients once a month, once every 2 or 3 weeks. Those are perishable skills that go away. And try to remember a checklist when you get into a higher level of acuity, such as the ER, or the person that comes in off the ambulance, kind of already in a fight or flight mode. Your adrenaline's kicking, their adrenaline's kicking. You're not remembering the 21 steps that you need to be doing for de-escalation. So that was kind of the problem I had with a lot of the methodologies that were out there. They were built, in my opinion, for more inpatient psychiatric or behavioral care places, not for the myriad of what we have in the hospital. The only other thing that I'll throw into that, so that's on the program specifically. The one other problem I'll have that's not necessarily program-based, but security-based, is there's a lot of talk in the industry. The forums are full with either hard uniform or soft uniform. And I believe they both have their place. One thing that I have clearly seen this year, we have hard uniform officers. We've transitioned a few to soft uniform. I myself used to wear a uniform. I do not anymore. I'm in business clothes, because it depends on the person you're dealing with. That hard uniform will get compliance, or at least complicity, with those that either have a criminal background or have criminal intentions. For the average person, maybe not. For some other groups of people, again, we kind of go back to the racial injustice, the political unrest, everything else, that may be a trigger to escalation or further escalation. Or you may be bringing in a preconceived notion of why you're there. When hard uniforms were originally introduced in security, I know especially in my past, it was used for compliance. It was used as a symbol of authority. Well, right now, a symbol of authority is not necessarily a de-escalator. So we phased our people into different uniforms, and we plan on doing more, so that when we see what the scenario is, we're sending the right officer in the right demeanor and the right dress to handle that situation.
I think that's really fascinating. When you look at a lot of different, quote unquote, use of force models, they often start with officer presence as the lowest level of force application, which I think is a good thought process, because we definitely see that just by inserting an officer into a situation, we change the nature of the situation, and that can be a good or a bad thing depending upon the outcome. And I think that fits into your soft versus hard uniform discussion there. The presence that they bring through that uniform can change that overall mentality or response pretty significantly.
Yeah, and I'll give you I'm definitely somebody that likes to put stuff into practical applications and not theoretical. So I'll give you an example. Our patrol zones, I have very few static posts, and our patrol zones are set up in concentric circles. So by the time you arrive on campus till the time you get inside the ER, you should have passed 3 officers because they continually have these circle of zones. And our exterior officer is on the outside of the building in a marked patrol car. Now, his job is primarily to deter wanton criminal activity. So he stays in a hard uniform along with the car and the lights, is a de-escalator and a deterrent in itself. Our ER person who sees the most acute patients and a lot of those that have questionable backgrounds. And again, these may be people that don't have cognitive awareness because of either substances on board or sickness or whatever. He's in a hard uniform also, again, to kind of give that level of authority and kind of, this is who I am, this is why I'm here, this is what I need you to do. But when we go further inside the hospital at either a labor and delivery desk or possibly another service check-in or a medical office building, security/concierge position, those we've went down to a softer presence. You can still see their security. They have their patches, they have so forth. You can still see their security, but it's not that police look to it. So it's more inviting. It kind of helps with the de-escalation. And then I myself in the business uniform, usually if there's a grievance with one of my officers or somebody else, and you always want to see who's in charge, you know. So when you walk up, you are identifying that that's who you are and why you're there.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing that you kind of touched on earlier was the in-house program that you developed. Can you share the approach that you've taken to developing that and how it's been working so far?
Sure, and we're about 60% through it. So we've implemented a lot of this. We have the plan, which I'll go over the whole program in its entirety. COVID, just like everybody else, has slowed us up on a few things where funding and other things come in. But what we did was we went to an in-house training program, and people take a recognizing aggressive behavior PowerPoint inside their health stream or their competency modules. So that goes to nurses, that goes to techs. It really touches everybody. It's 30 minutes, and all that is an awareness-based training. If you see these things, the person is escalating up to a certain stage. So there's 5 stages. Up to a certain stage, which is stage 2 for the online, you are able to de-escalate. So we kind of, here's the aggressive attitude, here's what you can do. Here's a little further aggressive attitude. This is what you can do. If you hit number 3, you need to back out, disengage, and go get help for someone else. So that's the PowerPoint. That's the way we can reach the most amount of people, 30 minutes, very low time requirement for that. The next stage we went to is an actual in-house training program that is 2 to 2.5 hours. It is role-based scenario. So one of the prerequisites is to have that PowerPoint. So now people have learned how to address aggressive behaviors, how to recognize aggressive behaviors. Now, when they get to the hands-on class, they are learning how to address that. So that level 3 through level 5, you know, how to be able to there's a lot that goes into it, a little too much to go into, but how to further recognize it, certain keywords to stay away from, certain keywords to use, when to have a second person in the room with you, when to back out and get your charge nurse or director because somebody is going to need a more authoritative approach. So we have that piece. Then we have a further training. This is the one I have not started yet, but then we're going to have a further training, which is strictly hands-on training, more around restraining someone and being able to some defensive tactics for people. And we have those slotted for security as well as our patient observation techs. A lot of people in the industry call them sitters. And also those people in the ED and that would be the first responders to a physically abusive patient. Now that's our training. The other piece that we've put in is a threat management team, and we've had really good success with that. So again, we have verbal, we have physical, and now we have a threat assessment. That threat assessment is really that preemptive approach. It's the one part that's proactive, because de-escalation means it's reactive regardless, okay? Somebody is already showing signs of aggression, so you're reactive. If you're going hands-on, you're definitely reactive. So the way that you get proactive with that is that threat management team. We flag certain patients that either have a previous history, again, those substance abuse, mental health, whatever, but also at the end of every nursing shift, they report any at-risk patient, such as multiple times out of bed, attempt elopements, things like that. And the threat assessment team consists of risk management, case management, somebody from an administrative role on the clinical side, and then security. And we get together and we each have a one-page sheet that's broken into things that the four of us are looking at specific to our role. So with security, ours is looking at environmental concerns and staff safety around that patient. And we're looking specifically at those. The other three members are looking at specific things for them. And we come up with this 24-hour care plan for the patient. Keep the staff safe, keep the patient safe. Every 24 hours, that is reassessed again until the patient is discharged.
I love that. I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talk about de-escalation being reactive. I think there are not enough organizations in our industry that are really focusing on proactive or preventative methods. And for me, one of the baseline personal philosophies that I have when dealing with workplace violence is that it absolutely can be prevented if we put the work into it. And it sounds like you guys are doing all the right things. I'm curious, you and I've talked just briefly about this, but I'm interested for you to share with our listeners kind of your thoughts on why workplace violence is such an issue in healthcare. I mean, we talk about the data ad nauseum. There's lots of people out there writing articles. We're seeing, big named publications putting out information about how violence is such an issue in healthcare. With all the stuff that you're doing and working towards, and we definitely see what you're doing is kind of a special carve out within the broader industry. We're not seeing what you're doing as something that a lot of people in the industry are going after. Why is workplace violence such an issue in healthcare?
Well, and I will say that for all these things that we've put in, we've seen a decline. The first 3 years that I was at my current organization, I've been here currently 6. The first 3 years that I was at my current organization, we dropped criminal activity by 36%. But again, we were very much in that quasi law enforcement mentality. And a lot of that was on the exterior zone that I talked about earlier, a lot of proactive patrolling, better access control, and deterrent factors. So those are easy. And when you bring in consultants or others that do workplace violence assessments, and I'll answer your question with this, is you have to be very careful about their background and what they're specifically looking at. Because what I find in a lot of workplace violence assessments, if you get your findings, you can almost carbon copy this for a lot of organizations. When you get your findings, it's going to talk about access controls, cameras, fences, and lightings. Okay, you're going to see those on all 4. That goes against criminal activity. Okay, 82%, I think the last time I saw the metrics, 82% of workplace violence in healthcare is patient or visitors on staff. Guess what? We're inviting those people into the hospital. They're past your fences, your lights, and your access control. So when you're looking at workplace violence, you have to look at, are you looking at those criminal actions such as active shooters, bomb threats, vehicular damage, and so forth? Are you looking at that specifically, or are you looking at the interior violence that goes on? Because that's a whole different skill set. And de-escalation, which we're talking about today, is the number one preventive thing you can put in. I would say number 2 is probably mobile panic devices, whether it's the voice era communication devices or actual standalone panic devices. I would say that's probably the second one. So summon help. But again, if you're summoning help, you're into a reactive mode. So to me, that de-escalation is really the only good proactive thing out there for workplace violence. So we're investing our time into criminal abatement or preventing criminal issues. And some of our touch strikes in the hospital are criminal based, but a lot of it is confusion, anxiety, and altered mental statuses. So is that really criminal? Sure, you can file charges, but is this something that was premeditated, intentional, that traditional law enforcement security modalities are going to prevent? I don't think so.
I think you're absolutely right. It means it's almost as if we just have a complete blind spot to that one area of the totality of violence prevention. And that's really the most important area. And I think in my mind, in a lot of ways, we ignore that area because it's too hard to deal with, right? And to your point, we're dealing with a lot of disease progression issues, not necessarily criminal intent. Criminal intent, we can put in a box and deal with that a little more effectively and a little more aggressively in different ways. But when we're dealing with disease progression, well, now we got to start talking more holistically. We got to start talking about this de-escalation training that we're giving our staff, the recognition, but we're also got to talk about medical care on some level and how we're treating those patients, because it definitely impacts the quality care environment along with the safety and security of our staff. And there's going to have to be kind of a shift in the industry at some point where we start to address that more effectively.
I think the two things that I brought up during my sales pitch of these programs to my organization and other organizations, that I kind of saw the light bulb go on, so hopefully others can use this too, is one was you do realize in businesses and in healthcare, most active shooters, because that's what everybody's mind goes to, so kind of use that almost. Most active shooters are either terminated employees or upset clients, patients, visitors, whatever the case is. So again, if de-escalation is on point and we're able to handle those grievances beforehand, it may not morph into this very scenario that everybody is worried about. Now, not 100% of the time you have your random acts of violence, but the numbers show that a majority of them are these preconceived methods. So that was one way we did it. Another big hurdle to get over in healthcare, and I think this is where a lot of security leaders kind of struggle, is you always hear that the customer is always right. Well, in healthcare, the patient and client is considered not there's this methodology that when we want to talk about the criminal base out there, that's real easy. That's the bad guy. We can blame him. We know it was him. When it comes to a patient, well, did they mean to do it? Did they not mean to do it? Well, maybe we were just having a bad day and didn't use the right words. Maybe it was the medication on board. Maybe you start to get this plethora, and all those may be very legitimate, but they almost borderline on excuse. And therefore, we don't get the buy-in to deal with those internal customers, which again are 80% of the workplace violence calls. So when you're talking about the blind spot, I think that's where the blind spot kind of is we do everything for our patients, which we should. But then all of a sudden, when we have to flip the script and say, well, this ownership is kind of on them for their actions. Well, wait, we're in charge of their care. So that's a very hard conversation to have, and you got to kind of feel out your administrators and know which direction they're going and which direction they're thinking. But I do believe that's largely that blind spot.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we're starting to see the industry wake up a little bit to that blind spot, though, and I think we see it in smaller areas like with your facility. I think we're starting to see it in my facility in a broad sense. There's others out there that are working in that direction. So I think we're starting to see that shift in the industry. I think it's coupled with shifts in the way we treat our security forces in general. And you mentioned this in your blog that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. But there's a big shift that I'm seeing and that I think is necessary in the way we treat our security forces from what that old school mentality of observe and report to now being functional business enablers within the organization. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I've struggled with this quite a bit. I've had both proprietary in-house and contract security officers. And I think a lot of it depends on the company that you use, but also your individual officers. The day that I took on contract, I had a meeting with them and I was very upfront with them. And I said, look, I don't care what name is on your patch. I don't care who you work for. In here, I am here for you. You're here for me, and we're one team, and that's it. You're not an expense line, and I think that made a big difference. With that, a lot of companies, whether it's internal risk management, if you have a proprietary service, or it could be contractor company policy, they're still kind of in that observe and report methodology. Some of it is because of risk avoidance. But I think a lot of it is just the training hasn't kept up. And the fact that we are seeing more acute people, the fact that workplace violence is such a hot topic, people call security. And again, this may be the disservice of the hard uniforms. People call security because they expect that quasi law enforcement to show up. They expect the problem solver to show up. And the very fact that you may have to go hands-on, is a reality. Our patient sitting program is much the same thing. You have patient sitters or patient watch programs to keep somebody from harming themselves or someone else or eloping. How do you expect to do that if verbal is your only skill? You're going to have to go hands-on. Even if it's defensively just blocking a door or whatever the case is, you are going to have to go hands-on for the safety of that patient and yourself. And security officers are expected to catch somebody trying to break into a car. And I'm not saying catch by arrest them or anything, but you're supposed to be responsible for rolling up on this person. Or if your dispatch center sees something going on, you are being dispatched to that scene. If you catch them in the middle of a felony or anything else, what are you supposed to do? Stand back and call 911? Anybody else working the organization to do that? And I just don't think the industry has really gotten to that level. And the only thing I can think of is, like I said, is that risk avoidance. Everybody's worried about, whose lawyer is going to be on fast dial for who. but it's just a legitimate reason and a legitimate cause that you are going to have to go hands-on with someone.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, one of the kind of mantras that I talk about with my staff all the time is you are going to either train for success or you're going to train for failure. And one of the things that I see is a huge issue in our industry is we continue to fail to provide the kind of training we need for those officers who are going to respond to any number of challenges in a given shift. From the moment they leave that pre-shift briefing or that roll call to the moment they go home at the end of their shift, they're going to encounter every range of problem. And to your point, from the majority of our clinical partners and those that we serve in our organizations, we're getting those calls because they look at that uniform as a set of tools and set of skills that can come and help with a variety of issues, whether that's helping someone find their way from the lobby to a location in the facility, or whether that's dealing with an active assailant. And so I think we've got to start rethinking and looking at training as a risk avoidance measure, right? The better we train, the better we equip, the better we focus those resources on the development of our officers, the more risk we're going to be able to avoid effectively.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll put on that is I've had both lethal armed and non-lethal, such as the taser. We have the taser currently where I'm at. I've had firearms prior to that. And I do believe I don't believe there's an answer you should or you should not have one of those two. It depends on your risk. You need to look at your CAP score. You need to look at the criminal activity within your geographical area. Don't just make that blind assumption that we should have this. Especially the one of the articles I seen published, I believe it was in 2017, was that 28% of active shooters occurred inside an organization, not just hospital, but inside an organization, because they were able to get the firearm away from security or law enforcement. You have to work that into your measures. But specifically to your piece about tools, I know a lot of times I talk how we are different than law enforcement. And I myself do not have law enforcement background. I kind of joke with some of my officers that, are 20, 25-year law enforcement. I says, you know what, we get a real bomb threat, I'm going to show up and I'm doing what you tell me to do because you have that background. Okay. And so you got to have that working relationship. But the one thing that I would really like to see, and I've talked to a few people in the industry about it, is those of us that are in healthcare security that have extensive law enforcement background, we really need to get some people together to come up with defensive tactics somewhere between law enforcement and civilian and come up with that security level. Because even now I have a phobia of, we are willing to put firearms on an officer, which is at the height of your use of force continuum. We're willing to put tasers on an officer, which I believe is the weapon that should be out there for people. And we're willing to put that, but we don't teach people hand tactics. And it's like, if you're really trying to deal with a situation at the lowest use of continuum possible, where are the hand tactics training? And it's just not out there in our industry. We've talked about getting like a training school, security training school, the D license that a lot of people get here in Florida. It kind of solidifies observe and report how to use a fire extinguisher more than anything. And then all of a sudden you jump into a department that may have everything from K9 to firearms to tasers to whatever. And we're not training that base scenario. Just through the pure years I've done this, and I had a couple of FTOs in my early career that were lifetime law enforcement officers. One of them had 32 years in law enforcement. They taught me how to do proper patrol tactics, how to enter a building when you do respond and the burglar alarms went off, to make sure that it's okay and everything else, how to safely stay at a distance in your car when you're approaching a vagrant or an unknown out on the street and everything. And again, if it was not for that person, I would have not have known that. And from working with a lot of contract companies, they cover things like bomb threat searches and workplace violence and active shooters and fire response. But again, they're not getting that middle ground. So I feel like we're arming with these high level forces, and there's still not a standard for how to do these others. IHOS has put out some great standards, and they talk about exterior and perimeter control. But again, the what is there, not the how. And I think that training, whether it's a teaching institute or something, really needs to come into this industry.
Absolutely. That's some good stuff. And the other thing too, this could be a different conversation altogether, but just some of those other tools, like when you mentioned the canines, made me think back to a conversation I had that, in terms of using canines, even just as a de-escalation tool and how effective they have been as well. So.
Yeah, they've definitely been used effective. Again, I would say that that's almost like considering firearms, though. You do have to look at your area. You have to look at the demographics of your area. There's a myriad of concerns. The top three things that I've heard when trying to pitch that idea to a few places is everything from infection control. So that has to do with the breed of dog or the type of dog that you pick. Whether is it going to be exterior only or interior? Are you going to keep them in the lobbies and main corridors? Or are you actually looking at patrolling ICU? There's a whole different scenario with that. The other thing is just, I would say, age and demographic makeup of your area, and how would they actually receive that animal. I think the program has benefits. But again, I don't think anything in security should be, here's a carbon copy, here's a template of what a security team should have. These are options. And now you have to weigh those options against the risk that you have in your area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talk a little bit about the tools in the tool belt. You got to have the right tool for the right job. One tool in the tool belt is not broadly applicable to every job, and I think sometimes you've got to tailor that to the organization and to the de-escalation needs of that organization. There are fascinating applications of the K9 program across the industry, which are great. But to your point, we still haven't really dealt effectively as an industry with defensive tactics. And so, we're looking at, this hyper specialization with things like K9 units, which is awesome. And we're trialing one now in my organization, which is really cool to see the impacts of that. But we've also got to be able to broadly equip our officers to deal with such situations and scenarios they encounter every day. Every officer is not going to have a K9. And so, yeah, how do we equip? How do we train? How do we prepare ourselves to be successful in the broad spectrum? And that's a big challenge. But I think we've seen some shifts in the industry that are really starting to open up opportunities for those discussions to happen and for us to see advancement in the way we approach those things more broadly across multiple organizations.
And one thing we didn't talk about, and I forgot, was I do not have these yet. It is something I am working towards quite feverishly, but I do believe another good solution for de-escalation is body cams. Now, I can tell you that is a very scary topic to bring up to a lot of people because we're working in the industry of HIPAA. And even though HIPAA can be mitigated and controlled with this, I would highly suggest you bring the legal team of a hospital that has the program into yours so they can talk, apples to apples on those, because that is who will have the CEO's or the president's ear on whether that happens in your facility. But, kind of like, even if you have a softer uniform, so we talked about the hard and soft uniforms, even if you have a softer uniform, but you have a body cam on, you have now softened the look, but you have added that whatever you say can and will be used against you. type response. And it really does bring down the emotions of some people, especially those that are borderline getting to that physical aggressive piece. It does bring it down, and you get a record. With over 400 cameras in the system, it still never fails that the camera is either looking at the wrong door or it happened just beyond camera. And when you have a body cam and security is responding to your high risk incidents, you are bringing the video proof to that incident. And to me, that's well worth versus hardwiring hundreds of more cameras throughout your facility.
100%. We've had body cameras at one of the hospitals in our system for a year now as part of a kind of a pilot. Phenomenal impact on de-escalation and personal accountability. They're phenomenal tools, and really an underrated tool, to your point. But man, you have to jump some hurdles with compliance and with risk and with the legal teams. But once you get past that, and we're now able through that proof of concept to start moving those out towards the broader organization. Man, they are tremendously impactful tools.
And all the concerns around them are around retention. Where's the video going to be stored at, and who has the ability to release it? So that's where I'm saying you've got IT and you've got legal. Those two have to be aligned for that program to work.
Right. And I think too, also just for the purpose of this conversation, while we're talking about body worn cameras, I just want to remind everybody as well that there is a IHSS. So the shameless plug, there's an IAHSS shared interest group happening on March 31st, being led by Ralph Cummings, that's discussing the topic of body worn cameras. Because again, I'm glad you brought it up, Ryan, because that was the next thing that I was going to ask you about. So it just kind of flowed naturally. But again, that's been a hot button topic as well. And I've been involved in a lot of conversations that have been focused in that area.
Brian, don't feel shame, man. We're all about the shameless plug. It's good stuff.
There's resources out there. A lot of time is just getting your hands on it.
Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation, Ryan. I'm super grateful that you were able to jump on the podcast with us and be our first guest. But man, that's some incredible discussion and valuable information. I'm excited to share it.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity. I have mad respect for both of you. And, this is my livelihood. I turned 45 years old in a couple of days. I've been in this 20 years, and by the looks of retirement, I got another 20 to go. So
it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 years, Ryan.
Yep.
Awesome stuff. Again, I'll reiterate what Mike said. Very appreciative of you coming on here. Again, respect the work that you're doing. Respect you as a person, having the opportunity to have met you in person. So yes, thanks again. And, look forward to further collaboration opportunities as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you both.